Thank you, everyone. I probably should have said, in terms of a performance background, I used to be a professional dancer in the dance industry, and I used to be one of Kylie Minogue's backing dancers, believe it or not. You know those people with the red visors in the videos? That's one of me. So the dance industry is a pretty grueling industry, just like sport. A lot of competition, a lot of setbacks, a lot of injuries. On self-employed work, if you don't perform, you don't get paid. You can't pay for your mortgage or put food on the table. It's a tough gig. Well, I guess that in part my interest in sport, and I used to be into a lot of golf when I was younger. Suffered a lot from performance anxiety. Used to hate playing competitive sport at a really high level because it just wasn't an enjoyable experience at all, and which led me into that whole area of resiliency and toughness. I learned at going to university and doing sports science degrees and psychology degrees about you can actually learn to improve in these areas, and you can get the support, all the things we've just been talking about today. So that links into some of the things I'm going to talk to you about. Before we sort of kick off, I just want to mention some of my colleagues about putting some of this presentation together and some of the work that I'll be discussing and some of the research that we're looking at in this area. Dr. Mustafa Sarkos from Nottingham Trent University. Him and David Fletcher, who's at Loughborough University, are really pioneers in the area of resilience in sport, certainly in the last few years, about trying to define what resilience is and how do you start to develop it. And as many of you know, if you can see it, many of you know Professor Cliff Mallett from UQ. Who doesn't know Cliff? Cliff is currently pretending to do some work in Munich at the moment and staying away but pretending to be busy. Anyway, he sends his regards to all of you who are here. So my PhD and master's thesis was in the area of mental toughness in particular. I'm not going to go into a conversation about is resilience the same or different to mental toughness. That's one for the academics in the room, we can discuss later. But it was really looking at what do we understand about a resilient and mentally tough personality. And when you know somebody who is mentally tough or resilient, what do you know about them? How do you know what this individual is like in terms of some of the fundamental personal qualities that makes them the type of person they are and who they are in terms of their identity? Before I get into all that though, we're doing a quick opening task. I want you to each recall a period or a moment in time when you were resilient. This can be to do with sport, it can be to do with work, your personal life. And when you've done that, think about these following questions. What got you through that time, or that particular moment? What were some of the resources, personal resources, that you drew upon to get you through? Thinking back now. Who or what helped you get through? And if you had to do it again, could you do it? Just take a moment to reflect on that. We'll all have one. You might be experiencing that right now. My wife just told me we're expecting our fourth child, so I'm right there, right now. A fourth boy as well. That's right. Everyone got one? Everyone got one? Just turn to the person next to you, and if you don't mind, share that experience. And what are some of the qualities that you are drawing on to get through that time? Go ahead. 1 minute. before? Yeah. Okay. All right, sorry to cut you short. No, I have to. Sorry to cut you short, folks. The first thing that you notice straight away is that we've all had these experiences. By the level of discussion in the room, we have all had an experience of when we've had to be pretty tough and pretty resilient. Would anyone care to share an example?
I'll go Tristan.
Great.
Well, you know, but I'm kind of 6 months ahead of you, I guess. Well, not at the fourth. This is just my first day. So the last 6 months has been kind of a new experience.
Mm.
Obviously a lot of good things, but I think on the whole, it's 6 months is pretty hard to solve. Plus new jobs, experiences, all that.
Mm.
So what got me through, what's getting me through, I think is social resources more than anything else. Most of my life, but also grandparents.
Yep.
I struggle with the psychological resources, but I don't think I'm much job, to be fair. I think the social resources are pretty good. Probably reflecting on what Jess said about his, but I think you have a degree of acceptance. When something goes on for as long as 6 months, you can't problem solve. You've got to have a degree of acceptance. Who and what I've kind of said in terms of this family. Could we go through it again? Yeah, definitely. Because you have a lot of positives, but also I guess you learn a lot about yourself and you develop.
Great, John. Thank you for that example. You highlighted beautifully the point which I'll make in the next couple of slides, which is when we think about resilience, some of us will immediately think that resilience is this internal thing, when in fact it's really a combination of things, of the interaction between the individual, the people that we are, and the context and the people that we surround ourselves with. And sometimes that environment and that context we find ourselves in are very supportive and facilitative. At other times, they really thwart our resilience and our ability to thrive. A different example. Thank you, John. Anyone got a different example? Yeah, great.
Bike accident a year and a quarter before London. So what got me through was probably the time frame. I had a deadline where I had to get a fit for selection and get selected for London. And I got there and just, I guess, fitter and stronger than ever with career PBs at an old age. What personal resources do I draw from? Probably experience. That would have been my fifth game, so I had a lot of experience in where I wanted to get to, how to work through that sort of challenge, I guess. What helped me through, I think it was everyone, from family to certainly friends outside of sport as well, that had nothing to do with sport. Certainly the network of QS, physio, the biomet, and everyone helped me get through there. My head's really getting down, I'm tired. but the deadline was different. I did have corrective surgery after I retired, and I know the attitude of recovering quicker wasn't there, so that deadline was there.
Yeah, sure.
So I probably never recovered quite the same as what I did the first time around, even though the operations and all that.
Great. Thank you for that example. One of the things that just hearing you talk there about the deadline is the importance of a particular goal that we're trying to achieve that gives us the will to do it, to get through, and the want to get through a particular situation in our lives for some end, what we deem as being some end gain, or what we hope the commitment and the input that we try and invest in ourselves and in the things that we're training for or practicing for will be somehow worth it in the end. We kid ourselves in some way that it will be worth it in the end. All this investment gets people through. Everyone in the room, we don't need specific examples of this, just to reflect on, has your resilience changed today as a result of that particular event? For some people, those events are so catastrophic, they're crippling, and they never recover. For other people, they have it within themselves, or they surround themselves with support networks that allow them to grow. We've heard growth talked about a lot, that lead them through the stages that David just went through to acceptance, and they're able to reflect back on some of the most horrific things you can imagine possible in a way that facilitates their life, or for the rest of their life. Why does that happen, and how does that happen, really interests me in terms of people's personal growth and for their ability to be resilient. Thank you for everyone for that task. What is psychological resilience? We asked for a definition. Well, I'm going to give you one. Fletcher and Sarker suggest that resilience is the ability to use personal qualities to withstand pressure. Is a sort of short, sharp definition of it. Let's unpack that a little bit. It's the ability to maintain functioning, whether that functioning be to do with your own personal well-being or to be able to perform to a level that you're capable of when under pressure. Another word for pressure would be stress, which David talked about at length. There's different types. Again, we've spoken about this already. There's robust resilience and rebound resilience. Rebound resilience would be the one that commonly people would associate with resilience. That would be the ability to be able to bounce back to some sort of homeostatic state or level of functioning. And robust resilience is about that protective quality, just the ability to withstand and take the pressure and take the stress and maintain performance. You're not bouncing back from anything. You're not coming back from injury or dealing with anything like that. So in many ways, it's preventative and proactive approach to managing stress. As I mentioned before already, it's the process resulting from the interaction of the individual and his or her environment. We're not talking about something that is deep within people and that's it. If we're going to say what it is, or at least I'm suggesting what it is through these works, what is it not? It's not a rare or special quality found only in certain extraordinary people. It's not this thing that some people just have or are picked, or by nature they have it. It's not a fixed trait. I'm going to talk a little bit about personality. Traits might be important, but it's not the only thing that resilience might be. So it's not a fixed trait. It's not found exclusively within a person, and it's not about the absence of suppression of emotions. We talked a lot about, implicitly and directly so far, about vulnerability be a sign of strength and sharing your vulnerabilities with other people. That many people would consider that that's part of the process to becoming a resilient individual. When we look at some of the literature in and around resilience, and we look at some of the personal qualities of resilient individuals, this is the kind of framework, I suppose, that is prominent within the literature at the moment. On the one hand, there at the bottom, there's people's personality characteristics, which are like the stable aspects of the person that we are, how we typically feel, think, and behave on a day-to-day level and over time. So things like how outgoing we are, how optimistic we are, how perfectionistic we are, these kinds of things. So resiliency can be understood in terms of personality, but it can also be understood at a psychological skills level, which are those cognitive effective strategies or our effective use of particular strategies to deal with things like acute stress and chronic stress, things like mindfulness, things like the images we create in our mind, things like how we regulate our arousal levels and how performers do that. These sit on top of the person that we are in terms of our personality. And the combination of our personality and our ability to execute particular psychological skills lead to desirable outcomes, we hope, such as our ability to focus under stress, our ability to manage relationships and be more emotionally intelligent, our ability to remain optimally motivated to get through difficult times. And all the time we experience different stresses and adversities in all their different forms, physical, psychological, etc. But we're embedded within contexts that is a resource in itself, as we've spoken about. People's partners, their coach, their friends, are bolstering how we deal with things and whether or not, or more often than not, we experience desirable outcomes from a psychological perspective. The work that I've done with my PhD and what the QAS and myself at QT and with Cliff at UQ is drilling in a bit deeper at what do we understand about this particular area, bearing in mind this sits within a context of other factors that might be important to understanding people's resiliency. And so this is a particular model that some of you who've seen me present before will recognise this. There's a lot of confusion around personality and what personality looks like and means. Fundamentally, to most people in the room, personality will mean things like people's personality traits. Now, traits are an important part of personality, but they're not the only thing, which I'm going to go through now. So this is a framework from a esteemed professor called Dan McAdams from Northwestern University, who is really making waves in the personality literature. When we're born, or anyone who's had the privilege of having children, when we're born, we immediately arrive with a particular temperament. That temperament is biologically and genetically influenced. Some kids are happy, some kids are sad, some are whingers, some are smilers, some are persistent, some aren't. The whole spectrum. That temperament, through subtle environmental influences that aren't always that predictable, start to develop into what's called our personality traits. Things like I mentioned before, how optimistic we are, how perfectionistic we are, how extroverted we are, how we get on with other people, how much of a worry we are, how vulnerable we get, etc. Traits describe the type of people that we are. You'll be making an assumption about my personality just from this presentation, and you'll describe me in terms of my personality traits. We do it all the time. She's really self-confident. She's a big worrier. We talk in that language, in the language of personality traits. And for sports psychology in particular, that's normally where personality psychology starts and stops. But to know a person really well, and we talked about, David in particular at the end, was talking about knowing the athlete. When you know an athlete or you know anybody really well, you know more than their traits and the type of person they are. McAdams suggests that by the time we get to about age 7, 8, and 9, it's a sort of the middle years of childhood, something else happens to our personality. We start to become really interested in goals. Goals that matter to the context and society that we're in. Our immediate family, to start with, our peers at school, and the wider community that we live in. People start to want stuff. Yeah, they've always wanted things to start with, like normally for little babies, they just want to be fed the whole time, or change their nappy, that's about it. But they're not socially desirable things. People start to want what society value. Being an athlete, being a policeman, being a farmer when you're a little kid. And that develops as you go through, you start to get older, as you start to go through primary school and into high school, and the sporting clubs and organisations for this particular context start to dictate what has value in your life. The traits are still there and going, but goals start to kick in, and values. People develop religious values, for example. By the time people start to get to 17, 18 into late adolescence though, personality thickens again, and we start to get what's called autobiographical reasoning skills. So we have the ability to remember events in terms of our autobiographical memory, but it's not until that late age that we start to connect the dots of the things that have happened to our life that give us a sense of purpose and meaning in our life. And it's at that age when, one, you get the cognitive capacity, and secondly, society demands that you become somebody. The question is, who are you going to become? What are you going to do with your life? Which university are you going to go to? All these questions, society demands that we become somebody, in a Western culture anyway, that we become somebody, and we have the cognitive capacity to start thinking back. And the question you're asking yourself is, who am I? And the way you get that information is by getting somebody to tell their story. And we've heard a couple of them today already. So when we think about personality, it can be thought about as 3 layers of understanding. The type of person we are, what we want, and who am I? And so as personality develops, and this is particularly interesting for many of the groups we work with, in terms of athletes coming into the programs and making that transition from sort of academy levels into professional levels, they are battling with this in particular in terms of their identity, in terms of who they are. And what's interesting about these 3 different layers is they vary in terms of their stability. Traits tend to be pretty stable over time. If you filled out a trait personality questionnaire today, you're probably the same in 10 years' time or in 30 years' time. But what you want in your life will be different because things happen and different priorities come into play. And how you make sense of your life and what really gives you a sense of meaning and purpose can shift quite dramatically depending on the people that we meet and, again, the events that happen in our lives. So to understand the person, you know, when you think about the people that you know really well, or flip it on its head, the people who know you really well, they probably know a lot about these 3 different areas. Why am I telling you all this? I'm telling you it because to understand somebody who's resilient is to understand them, their resiliency at these 3 layers of understanding. Bearing in mind that we're only talking about personality, which sits within the context of other things that are important, like psychological skills and the support networks that come in. So this relates to some of the work I did on my PhD, which was looking at some of the personalities of people who are in AFL. And this is layer 1, and it asks a question of what type of person is a mentally tough individual. So we gave them some Big 5 personality questionnaires, which is measuring things like, as you see here, extroversion, neuroticism, etc. The group came out as being low to very low in neuroticism. They're emotionally hardy individuals. They're pretty high in extroversion, pretty socially dominant, tend to be the leaders in the group. Bearing in mind we're working on tendencies here, doesn't mean you can't be mentally tough and be introverted. They tend to be pretty highly agreeable. These are pretty compliant, trusting individuals. The world's a pretty safe place to them. They feel pretty comfortable. And as you would expect, extreme off the charts in terms of conscientiousness, in terms of achievement striving and being pretty well disciplined. That tells you something, but it also tells you nothing about these people. We need to know more. To know the person, you need to know more than this. We then got them to do some striving exercises where you give them sentence stem and you go, in football, what are you trying to do, typically, on a day-to-day basis? I don't mean like particular training tasks, but broadly speaking, what are some of the motivational things that you're trying to achieve? I'll read some of these out because they haven't come out particularly well in here, but push my body to its limit. Never lose. Never give in if it's getting hard. Give my best, get the best out of myself. Not waste a day. Achieve all the tasks. Be perfect in all that I do. Make my teammates respect me. What you do with these is you start to code them and you start to look at what are some of the motivational themes that these particular individuals are starting to piece together. In some ways they're very approach orientated, but in others they're quite avoidant orientated. Never lose. Never give in. It's this idea about trying to avoid the consequences of what would it mean to lose? What would it mean to give in? What would it say about you? One of the questions I wanted to ask Romelda was what it was like to experience the frustration of being not selected, when she even said to this day that she's still pretty angry and pissed off about it. is part of her drive to be successful to avoid experiencing that experience? We don't know. She's not here, and she may not know either. But in her subconscious. You can code these for what's called agency and communion. People who are agentic want to get ahead of the group. All of these are pretty much, apart from the bottom one about helping others, is all about getting ahead of others. They're fueled with achievement, themes, and power. About being better than others or being an influencer on others. This is what this group want, which is different to the previous question about what type of person they are, but what do you want? And the third part was about doing life story interviews. So you do a life story interview, just like you saw Jonah do this morning, about taking me through your life. What are the main chapters of your life? What are the key events in your life? What were the turning points? What were the setbacks? What was the best moment in your life? All these types of questions. And this is a case study we're just about to have published in the European Journal of Personality, where we drilled in deep with one individual who was pretty representative of quite a lot of the group in terms of the key themes, who talked about his life. He's at the time of the interview, was a captain of one of the AFL teams. And his story, his life story, is fueled with redemption. Redemption is about when bad stuff happens, with commitment and optimism, it'll come good in the end. Not everybody tells that story. A lot of people tell the story of the heartache and the bad stuff that have happened in their lives, and it continues just to get worse. And life's a pretty dark, horrible place. These individuals did not tell that story. Interesting enough, all the people we interviewed had not made the draft the first time round. But they saw that as being a good experience in some way, that helped them to grow. And we talked about growth a lot. This individual saw themselves as an active agent who can influence the world. I can have an impact on the people around me and where I go in my life. They all play certain characters, and this individual was this heroic leader, captain of the team, saw themselves as being the individual who is going to lead this group to a premiership flag. Story of legacy. The question you ask people, so you told me a life story, where's it going to end? Where's the story go next? And this individual, like many others, Romello talked about Commonwealth Games, I'm going to do it, it's going to happen, is legacy. I'm going to achieve something that people are going to remember me by. And for Wade, the alias, and for others that we've interviewed, some of them are very religious. And the power of religion in this people's story as a coping mechanism is incredible. And when you feel that God's in your corner, you can get through a lot of things. And you can reconceptualize things in many ways, that it's God's will. And I was meant to go through this path to become a better person. And so what we notice with this and others is that there's a lot of coherence in their identity. They know who they are in terms of the type, not just the type of person they are, what they want. They know themselves really, really well. To compare some of the results, some researchers in the UK have just done a big study in and around what are the personal qualities of super elite athletes. To give you a definition of super elite athletes are multiple medal winning athletes. And they looked at the personalities, essentially, and the psychosocial development of athletes who had won multiple gold medals, or at least medalled on podiums, versus those athletes who had gone through the same programs as them but not performed to what they were expected to, at least to achieve. There's lots of stuff. It's a massive article, it's like 100 pages. If we were to break this down in terms of the three layers, the super elite group, high conscientiousness, obsessive perfectionists, ruthless and selfless in pursuit of their goals. At layer 2, what do they want? They need success. Success was a real burning thing that they required. Driven to win and to be the best they can be, but at the same time, others were about avoiding the pain associated with loss and failure of the past. I don't want that to ever happen again. And similar to what we've just seen in the case study I just showed you, their life stories are fueled with redemption, they're active agents on the context, legacy came up again, and in particular, as probably the most important theme, is unity. When you think about your own life and the things you've been able to get through, You will go to the nth degree if you know who you are. Our lives are in disarray, or we find difficulties, or we have mental health problems when we're not quite sure who we are or what we're doing, or why we're doing it. McAdams suggests that when we look at the social influence on personality, it impacts differently at different layers. This is layer 1, 2, and 3. The kind of person we are is deeply influenced by genetics and our early environment, our early experiences as kids, which set us on a trajectory to have certain traits. But what we want in our lives and what we value can be more dictated by the context that we find ourselves in and the people that we build relationships with, and even more so at what gives us a sense of meaning and purpose in our lives. And this also reinforces when we think about resilience, why we tend to think about resilience as a particular trait, often in terms of a personal quality. It's actually the social influence and how the context that we're in impacts us as people at these two layers that I find particularly fascinating and interesting. In terms of the work that we're looking to do here at QAS, is to look at the role that in-depth personality assessment can have for fostering quality coach-athlete relationships. So what we're going to do is, and there's various sports, we're contacted with rowing, swimming, cycling, netball, to put coaches through and their athletes through the personality assessment a little bit, and what I've just described to you today, of the different layers of personality, about trying to improve what we know about the people that we work with. So quite a confronting thing. But we know that when there's high quality relationships, when you understand somebody really well, you are building the foundations for a high quality, persistent, committed, resilient relationship. And this is the question we're really asking: who's the person behind the coach or the athlete? When you know the answer to that question, you really know those individuals well. And we're also assuming that relationships are a source of resilience in people. Think about the mentors you've had in your life, the people who have been really influential to you. That in itself is just an indicator that we play for the people that are important to us, whether they be kids, partners, teachers, coaches, etc. And that's what we're going to be looking at. In terms of developing resilience, to look at it simply, it's about getting the balance right between how we're going to challenge people and how much support we're going to give them. We can develop very unrelenting environments where leaders ridicule poor performance, blame cultures for high standards not being met, sink or swim environments, people feeling pretty isolated. All challenge, but no support, or low support. If we give high support and low challenge, we create this very comfortable environment. Over-caring, talked about it before, parent-like culture, too cozy, people are described as being nice in that environment. Difficult conversations are avoided and underperformance is not addressed. Low support, low challenge, leaders and managers are unseen, people aren't really stimulated, a culture of mediocrity, and good performance is more by accident than design. What we really want to strive to create here is to create an environment where you're challenging people to their potential and what they can be stretched to, but you have to create the support to be able to do that. What does that look like? Create challenging goals. People thrive in a challenging but supportive environment. They want to seek out challenges, crave constructive feedback. This is the area we're focusing on in particular. Good relationships between performers and leaders. By good relationships, I'd say quality relationships and being able to know each other well. Healthy competition, people support each other, etc., etc. So the point that I really want to get across in terms of this particular presentation is Firstly, that resilience is a combination of between the person and the context that they're in, which I think we've established pretty well so far across the three speakers so far, including this one. And at a personality level, to understand resilience, you need to look at them in terms of the type of person they are, what do people want, and how do people get a sense of meaning and purpose in their life. And at different points in our lives, we will experience that. But it won't last forever for the same particular goals. Because people achieve goals or they find other interests that give them a sense of meaning. And that, for me, impacts our ability to persist and to commit. That's it for me. Thank you.
Fantastic, mate. Thanks a lot.
That's right.
To the floor straight away. Any questions for Tristan? Alan?
How does someone go about teasing out someone's life story? It's actually, must be a very difficult thing.
Yeah,
They probably don't even really know their own life story.
No, I think you're right. Well, the reason for doing the life story is when you ask people, who are you? That's a difficult question. That's a difficult question to answer. Like, who am I? Like, how do I even answer that? Unless you've considered it and taken time to do it. The life story interviews are a really good way of doing it. So the first task you would do with a life story interview is to get the person to imagine that their life is a book or a novel. And it's a reasonably semi-structured interview. So you get them to do this task, and you get them to imagine that when they open the book, that if they were to see their life as the contents page of that book, what would it look like? What would be the chapters? What would you call the chapters? And you start them off from there, and you go through about 20 minutes to 30 minutes of them just going through those particular chapters. You then get them to think about the key scenes in their life, like I said before, the high points, the low points, the turning points, the moments of wisdom, the moments of spirituality. So you're really kind of going in quite deep here into people's lives. The greatest challenge that they've ever experienced, the kind of questions. The moments of regret, the moments of loss, which you build to once you've got some rapport and getting them talking. And what you finish up with at the end of the interview is, which can take between 2 to 3 hours, is you get them to reflect back and go, you've just told me, great, you've told me all these different things. What's the kind of plot? What's the plot running through the story? And you almost have to go through all of those phases for them to arrive at going, this is the plot. And people are surprisingly good at being able to give you an answer. In fact, I've never done one where no one's been able to answer that question. And what they're really telling you is the story that they tell themselves, which is all about their identity. In a story form. And in the personality literature, narrative identity has been probably going for about 20 years now, but it's starting to seep into sports psychology literature. And it's really all the stuff that when people have conversations with, in and around the hallways of any organisation, it's the stories that you capture from people that we sometimes hear but we miss at the same time, and what they're really doing is telling you. So we heard from Romelda this morning when she's talking about her life, she's constructing her life in such a way that says that she's this type of person. She could have told her story in 100 different ways. Or maybe not 100, but 10 different ways in and around the events that have happened. But she told it in that way that actually portrayed a person who's actually pretty resilient, who can get through stuff, can make transitions from one country to another country, can get through setbacks. And that's the story you tell yourself when you experience difficult things in your life. And when people talk about having self-belief, they're telling themselves a story that I can get through, based in part on the story that they tell themselves, based on fact and a bit of myth to connect the dots. So a life story interview is how you do it.
Fair point, down back.
Yeah.
You get a lot of negatives when they were talking about resilience, like people talk about injuries and things that have happened. Does it always come across as it's been a negative at the first instance? Like
In doing those interviews, you mean?
yeah, or was there a real positive when there was a real good thing and it helped out?
Yeah. It depends. When you get people to talk about the lowest points in their life, it's pretty poignant. and normally pretty difficult, but people are happy to talk about it. And at some point, for the majority of people that you talk to, they've made sense of it. They've had time to accept the situation. Revisiting it there and then is quite a difficult thing sometimes, not always. But it's not uncommon for people to get a bit teary about the whole thing, understandably. But even just talking about it through an interview, people enjoy the process of talking about their own life because people don't actually ask them very often about their own lives. And for the individuals that I've only spoken to, who are deemed to be pretty tough and resilient individuals, without doubt take a tremendous amount of growth from what they've experienced. And some have experienced these horrific things. But they see it as being, it gives in part their life a sense of purpose moving forward that fuels the fire for them to commit. And to commit to all the difficult things that they have to do to be the best performers in the world.
I guess I'm leaning towards young athletes. For them to become more resilient, they have to actually experience real negative things to happen before they can become more resilient.
Yeah, good question. There's the opinion on that, and then there's the science. The science isn't quite sure, I don't think, in terms of whether people have to experience those things. I was thinking about the question earlier on, in and around, do you have to put people through tough situations for them to be tough? That is, only if the support's there to help them make sense of it. Sometimes people work it out for themselves, but I think you have to have the support there as well as fundamental. Because a lot of people won't be able to recover from those things, and you'll lose them. They'll drop out the sport and they'll do something else.
Any last questions on the porches of time? Sean?
The McAdams model, the 3 layers, I noticed there's transition points there at sort of semi-specific ages. How did he come up with those ages and how flexible it is? Is it around that? And particularly the final one, which would seem to be the critical one in this whole model. Can we try and shift that earlier?
Great question. To give you, if you want to find the lengthy answer of that, he has a book called The Art and Science of Personality Development, which came out in 2015. And it's really based on sound scientific grounding of how people develop. From the moment the moment they're born through to older age, what are the factors, the biological factors, the social factors that come into play when people develop. And so he's very convincing in his argument about these being the particular ages when people start to, when their personality starts to thicken, if that's the right way of putting it. Children, if you ask children to go what's particularly meaningful in their life and they're like 10 years old, will struggle to give you that answer, other than say something like Pokemon, or whatever, or whatever they're into at that particular time. So that's an example of people not having the cognitive capacity to think, what's happened to me? So let me think backwards. Let me go backwards in time and think about event A, B, and C, and what does that all mean for me now? People don't have that capacity until they're late adolescents. So you're not able to shift that. And also, I bring in the social element is, in this particular culture that we grow up in, that people start to demand, what are you going to do with your career? Or who are you going to become? So there's a social aspect too, which is difficult to shift.
Thanks so much, mate. That was really insightful and appreciate you giving the time. I guess for me, what I took from it was, for the staff in the room that work with athletes every day, can you answer what your athletes' wants, values, meaning and purpose are? I'm assuming you can tell me which Olympic cycle they're targeting and what their PB wants to be in the next 6 months, but can you answer what their values are, what their wants are, what's meaningful and purposeful for them in their lives, and maybe taking some of what Tristan shared with you into your daily interactions with athletes would be great. Thanks, mate. I appreciate the time.
Pleasure. Thank you.